a large crowd at this time of the term. So thank you very much, and we're very excited to present this lecture. I'm Sandra Toes, and I am the program director for the information programs and also the chair of the Department of Information Science here within the Faculty of Management. And we're very excited for this lecture today. So just a couple housekeeping things. First of all, I just want to acknowledge and thank our co-sponsors for this event. So the Dalhousie Office of the Vice President of Research and Innovation, so Dr. Alice Aiken. The Dalhousie Libraries, so of course Michael Vandenberg, Dean, and we have Melissa here with us today. Where did she go? Oh, there she is. It's like I was just talking to her. Excellent. Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, so Dr. Jennifer Andrews. Dean, Faculty of Computer Science, so Dr. Andrew Rao Chaplin, Dean. Faculty of Medicine, Dr. David Anderson, Dean. Faculty of Science, Dr. Charles McDonald, Dean. And of course our own Faculty of Management, with Acting Dean Michael Smith. So the breadth of people involved in this shows how important this topic is and how it touches on so many different things. But before we start, I just wanted to start off with Dr. Victor McDonald, who coordinated this for us. I had found an interesting tweet from Richard Poindner, who is saying, "I'm signing off from reporting on open access. The movement has failed and is being rebranded in order to obscure the failure. Time to move on." So we thought that would be a provocative
it is.
point to start from. And of course now I want to introduce our wonderful guest, Dr. Maria Pawlowska. And she is an expert in research management with a focus on scientific data management and open science. Following her PhD in Earth Sciences from the University of Cambridge, she transitioned to a career in research administration and policy and has for over a decade of experience in managing international interdisciplinary research projects and implementing and designing open science policies. She has collaborated with European governments and non-governmental organizations, as well as Fortune 200 companies. She has helped establish over a dozen new centers of excellence, working with institutions such as Oxford University and CNRS. She was also a member of the Science Europe working group that authored the Practical Guide to the International Alignment of Research Data Management. In the past year, Maria has shared her experience on open science at meetings organized by the United Nations and the European Commission, among others. As a guiding principle, Maria works to ensure that modern research management, including supporting openness, diversity, and inclusion, has become part of the blueprint for how science is done. Her work has been recognized by numerous organizations. She is a Bill and Melinda Gates Scholar, a member of the American Academy of Achievement, and has received awards from the Cumbria Group, the Cambridge Philosophical Society, and the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office, among others. And we are incredibly fortunate that she's now involved in the implementation of open science practices here in Nova Scotia. So I will turn things over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this very kind invitation. It is truly an honor to be here and talk about open science. And I think I'll just get to it, because I've been told I have about 40 minutes, and I could literally do this for 4 hours. So I will just go straight to it. I will tell you a little bit about what open science and open research is and why I tend to use the terms interchangeably. I will also mention open access. I will give you the international timeline and context, and then talk about the Nova Scotia Open Research Project that I am currently working on, and a little bit about policy co-creation and open science going forward. I will not talk about me, since I thank you, Sandra, for that wonderful introduction. I will just maybe say that I am now based here in Wolfville, about an hour north of here, and Nova Scotia is wonderful. So thank you. Okay, let's get to it. What is open science? I don't know how well you can see this, but it's probably too late now to turn off the lights, so I'll just talk about it. I am using the UNESCO definition, the UNESCO framework for what open science is. And a lot of researchers, when I come into the room and say open science, about 80% of the room will go a little bit pale and maybe start sweating just a little bit because it's going to be about open access and about open data. And these things, for different reasons, tend to be maybe stressful, challenging, and I'll start with those two. And there's no pointer here, I keep looking for one, but I just want to note how open access, so scientific publications, and open data are just two little pieces on a little piece of a much bigger pie, and I'd like to get to all of that. But to begin with open access and open data, I do agree that what has happened with open access now is not what we wanted to happen. And when we get to the timeline, I am happy to talk more about that, because there actually is there's a reason for why we are where we are. And I don't want to focus too much on that right now, but I would like to, I don't know what the tweeter, if that's the right noun, had in mind when they were saying that it's not, that the system is broken, but I think a lot of it has got to do with APCs, so article processing charges, which are up to $9,000 per submitting an article to Nature if you want it to be published open access. That is not what the authors of the open access policies had in mind when they came up with those policies. It is my personal opinion, and everything I will say here is more or less my personal opinion, is that it is absolutely wrong, unethical, and not what we should be doing. This is not where money should be going. Just a few fun facts, which are not my opinions, but actual facts. Per dollar invested, for-profit publishers, the top 4 make more money than Amazon. And Amazon actually sends you that piece of plastic thing you ordered from them, right? For-profit publishers, it is questionable at this point what the added benefit is. There's just a paper out showing how APCs, doing the numbers, APCs, article processing charges, again, it's a really nice name for if you pay us, we'll make it open access. They are $2 billion annually, American dollars at this point. That is money that I personally think should be going elsewhere than into the pockets of a for-profit industry, the goals of which are at this point pretty much completely misaligned with the goals of most researchers in the community that they serve. So, and when I say for-profit publishers, I mostly mean the big 4, the Wileys of this world and the Nature Springers, right? I'm not talking about smaller, there are different flavors of open access, if you will. Personally, me and a lot of people in the open access and open science movement are big supporters of Diamond Open Access. Free to read, free to publish. It is possible, and I'm happy to talk more about the models, but the current APC-based model in for-profit publishing is not what we want, and it's not the direction I'd like things to go. Open data, and so just as an introduction, because I know a lot of you are thinking a lot about open access, and there are ways of publishing open access without paying thousands of dollars, and I am more than happy to talk about those ways later. I will talk a bit more as we go through the presentation, but I want to be very clear as we start off. I am not a supporter of APCs and open access through APCs. Open data. I have had a lot of conversations about open data in the past few months. And some people will say open data is great if I'm the one who doesn't have to open my data. I want everyone else to open their data. That is a real... I am paraphrasing, and that person was actually self-aware enough to say, yeah, I know I shouldn't, but this is what I actually think. And a lot of people are actually not as self-aware. They'd be like, open data is great, but I can't open mine. And there are all sorts of reasons why you can't open your data. Some of them are legit reasons. If you're studying refugees and you have interviews with those refugees, you probably can't make them open ever because people might die, literally. And that's a really good reason not to make your data open. By the way, interviews are data. If at this point, the only people doing research that we consider to not have data are very theoretical physicists and mathematicians. Otherwise, you probably have data, even if you're not calling it that. If you're an art historian, the literal pictures you look at are your data, if you're an art, like visual art historian. Right? There are all sorts of data that you have, even if you're not thinking of it as data. There might be privacy concerns if you do medical data. Those are usually dealt with quite easily and efficiently at this point without anonymization. There's a conversation to be had, but just saying privacy concerns, if you have what I call, and I am a former researcher in the earth sciences, so I am allowing myself to say this, Excel spreadsheet scientists. If your data comes in more or less an Excel spreadsheet, then you are an Excel spreadsheet scientist, and again, with all due respect from a former researcher who did exactly that. And you can make your data 99.9% of the time, you can make it open if you want to. And what is holding you back, quite likely, can be all sorts of, the State of Open Data report just came out 2 weeks ago. And a big problem is managing the data to make it open. That is an actual issue. You need time, you need people, you need skills. Not everyone has them. When I talk about research data management with people, and this is sexist, but it's also a direct quote, the response I usually get is, I have a guy. That is the response to how do you manage your data. And the I have a guy is not a person who's necessarily based at your lab and a postdoc who's trained in managing data. It is a colleague at the other end of the corridor who knows about data, and you get them cookies every once in a while, and then they manage your data for you. That is not a sustainable system for research data management. And that is, however, a legit concern in terms of I can't make my data open. There are other concerns, which we call psychological, and there was a great report, actually, right out of Halifax here, Dalhousie, about the psychological barriers to sharing data. And they are, by far, in the community, in the open science community, we consider them to be the greatest barrier to sharing data, because I don't want people to take it personally, because please don't, but if you've seen Lord of the Rings, or maybe read the actual books, there's a character there, Gollum, who keeps walking around and talking about my precious. And that's sort of the frame of mind. And there are lots of conversations to be had here. And firstly, a lot of the time, your data is probably funded with tax money, which makes the whole my data thing, the ownership of the data, that is a conversation to actually be had. But that there are also other aspects of the my data and why I don't want to share it. I will get to that actually later on in the presentation when it comes to career progression, for example. That is something people worry about. Unfortunately, those are very legitimate concerns, and it's worth talking about why we have those concerns. Finally, the last, well, not the last, but one of the other major concerns about sharing data is, what if there are mistakes in my data? And what if people find them and my career is ruined? And I keep thinking, you know, if I wanted to write a script and submit it to Hollywood, people would laugh me out of the room if this is the script I submitted, saying, how about we have two honesty researchers, one from Harvard, one from MIT, and 20 years into their careers, it turns out they were 100% fabricating their data. And Hollywood would say, please leave. I mean, I'd never get into the room for starters, but if I did and I pitched them, they'd ask me to please leave because that sounds ridiculous. Except this is just what happened. This year, we now have evidence that the two biggest honesty researchers in the world have been fabricating their data. One at MIT, one at Harvard. Okay, this is, it's a real thing. And the really, for me, unfortunately sad part of the story, one of them, the one at Harvard, was one of the best paid Harvard researchers, and a female, and it turns out she was making all this money off of lies. So I guess yay for equal opportunity lying, I don't know. But this would not have happened. They would not have gotten away with it if they had to submit their data openly. That's how they got caught after 20 years of haranguing them for their data.
Light at the end of the tunnel.
Yes, there we go. But if they had to submit their data at with the first paper, then they get caught 20 years earlier. And you know, I'm not even so sorry about them. They are flush with cash and they can wipe their tears with $100 bills. They have PhD students and postdocs whose lives they ruined. And none of these PhD students or postdocs went into academia thinking, yes, I want to fabricate data. Since the day, you know, they went to a museum at the age of 6 and decided they want to grow up to be a researcher who fabricates data. No one does that. That is a reason why no one goes into academia. But these people will never get a job. All their papers have been retracted and their reputations are forever smeared for having worked with these people. Another reason to care about open data, if you happen to be a human who happens to have a human body, who foresees at some point in their lifetime having to see a doctor. There was a paper out in Nature this summer, Nature and not the online journal of conspiracy theories, that 30% of the medical data in clinical trials has been pulled out of somebody's back pocket. 30%, folks. So that means if your doctor is doing the thing we want them to be doing, if they're doing evidence-based medicine and using clinical trial data and recommendations based off of clinical trial data, 30% of the time they might be telling you do this when in fact you shouldn't, and you might get sick or die or not feel very well. 30%, I mean, I can't stress this enough. This is horrendous. And it's not just the pharma-funded studies, to be clear. These are also researcher-led studies. And again, I'll throw that number at you one more time. Almost a third of clinical trial data is not clinical trial data from actual clinical trials, but from somebody's back pocket. So if everyone had to submit their data, this would not be an issue. Because a lot of the time, these are not statistical geniuses who try to mess with the data. You want a good use for AI, this is a great use for AI, running your basic t-test on these things. A lot of the time, that's all it takes. And those of you who are worried about a mistake in your Excel spreadsheet, this is how it works. Someone looks at your data, finds a mistake, emails you, and you say, shoot, I'm sorry, and you correct that mistake. Unless you've been fabricating data for 20 years, Dan Ariely style, you're fine. No one's going to ruin your career over a mistake or a whole bunch of mistakes in a single study that you made the data open for. Unless you've chosen to go down the data fabrication for a career lane, then you are fine, because nobody's career gets ruined over legitimate, honest mistakes in their data. This is not how you get into the New Yorker. Which Dan Ariely did, yet again, with his data fabrication, right? Other aspects of that part of the pie, of the open scientific knowledge. We have, we have open software, which is an increasing conversation. We have open hardware, because not everyone, you know, who's very smart lives within a 50-kilometer circumference of Boston, Massachusetts, or any other big city with access to hardware. COVID taught us a lot about how you can actually use hardware while being on the other side of the world. And it's amazing how much that does for research and equity. Because, I mean, this is, open science, I think, is really, really good for science. And one of the reasons why is equity. If you think, if every smart person in the world who wanted to cure cancer cure cancer or do anything in research, started off at the same playing level field, right? We all knew exactly the same about the particular molecule we wanted to study, because it wasn't paywalled and because my institution didn't have access to those paywalled articles. But actually, even in countries that don't always have the resources to pay for some of these journals, by the way, folks, $70,000 US per annual subscription. $70,000 for one journal. This is chemistry. So, and then you have to pay to publish in it as well. So if every one of us who wanted to study this molecule again could read all the latest research on that molecule and then do our own modeling based on all the latest research, the world would be a better place, quite frankly, and we'd all be better off, because we wouldn't have people reinventing the wheel or being unable to even talk about inventing the wheel because of the paywalls. And if we add to that the hardware and the software, then we are talking about actually trying to solve climate change and cure cancer globally with all the brightest minds at it, and not just the brightest minds that happen to live more or less in the Northern Hemisphere, right? Because the Northern Hemisphere does not in any way, as I'm sure we all know at this point, have a monopoly on smart people. And the open science movement makes it possible to try and even out some of those global disparities in terms of access and the ability to do groundbreaking science. So that is the open scientific knowledge part of the pie. We have open dialogue with other knowledge systems. As Sandra's mentioned, I am originally a European. I am what's so endearingly called in this country a New Canadian. And in Europe, we have about 3 indigenous populations left, quite frankly. But that is not the case on this continent. And open dialogue with other knowledge systems makes so much sense here. And it's not just, again, it's not just about equity. The First Nations on this continent have been telling us forever that they've been here before the last glaciation. And mostly white Western archaeologists have been telling them, no evidence, sorry, no, not true. Until last year, when they found the footprints and they dated them, and lo and behold, it turns out that if we could have listened, and we could have made that part of the conversation, and they were right. We now have the scientific evidence that all those oral histories, and again, this is Western science. If something isn't written down, it's nowhere near as valuable as an oral history, right? But that is our own prejudice and not actually an objective way of dealing with research. So incorporating those other ways of knowing is a big part of the open science movement. Again, it's not just the right thing to do in terms of human rights or just common human decency. It's the right thing to do in terms of actual research. Another thing on this continent, fire ecology, fire management. The reason why we are in as dire straits as we are is because we brought over fire management strategies from Europe. By we, I mean Westerners, white people, immigrants when they came, right? They could have listened to the First Nations, and which have been doing North American appropriate fire management since time immemorial. And they were like, nope, we know how to do it the way we've been doing it back in Europe. And we have the fires we've been having for the past 120 years out of control, right? And again, it's not just the decent thing to do, it is actually the evidence-based right thing to do to incorporate other ways of knowing. Open engagement of societal actors. So open science is not just about taking research out of the ivory tower, but it's also about bringing people into the ivory tower in meaningful ways. And so you don't just give out a survey. That is not necessarily a meaningful way of incorporating the community in your research. It can be one of the ways you do it. But I've had interesting conversations with people who do healthcare research and patient partners, which they don't necessarily think of in the open science framework, but that's what it is. So if you're a professor of something, you study in healthcare, rheumatism, and you don't personally suffer from rheumatism, which is great for you, but you bring in someone with that condition, a bunch of patients, before you start designing studies, and you talk to them. What is your problem? What is something you deal with that you would like us to research? What is an actual literal pain point for you that research could help with? And researchers who work with patient partners tell me that it takes a lot of time. There's additional time at the study design phase, but they will not turn around and do it any other way ever again, because it's actually half their bench to bedside time. So the research actually is applied instead of 4 years, within 2 years or less. And they feel like they're making a way more valuable contribution than if it's just a bunch of people who don't necessarily have lived experience of a condition coming up with sometimes very theoretical concerns and then researching those, right? So that's one way of actually engaging partners, not just as study subjects, but actually at the design phase. Whether you're doing environmental toxicology, anything, actually, firstly, if you're doing anything with humans, then you can probably do this. But if you're doing anything in a place where humans live or that concerns humans, you can actually incorporate community partners in a way that'll be valuable for them as well as your research. And finally, open science infrastructures, which is the most technical part of this. These are your repositories, your preprint servers. And actually, so speaking of repositories, Canada is actually in a wonderful situation where there are federal and national data repositories. There are whole countries in Europe that have open science policies and open science requirements that don't have federal and national repositories. So the way it's done in a lot of European countries is, here's an open science policy, and you, individual researcher, figure out a way to do this. The way it's been done in Canada is actually the RDM, the Research Data Management obligation, has been put on the leadership of institutions, which again, I mean, I know those of you who are institutional leaders might not necessarily be big fans of that, but believe me, it is a way more humane way of doing it than just telling an individual researcher, you want a grant, you want money, figure out a way. It's really actually more effective for the whole institution. And again, there are actual federal repositories here that people can access. All of you can access. That is, again, not the case for a whole bunch of countries whose total population is way, way more than Canada, and they don't have national repositories. So just a fun fact there. So why do we do open science? And I've touched on all of these, but I just wanted to there's a nice little slide. Increased visibility, it's not rocket science, it's open access, more people, make it available and they will come. It drives on innovation. We actually also have bibliometric research on this now. If the data and the papers are there, people tend to do things with them. Public access, which I've had these conversations with Yves Gingras, who is at the University of, Montreal, who tells me, my dad would never want to read any of my papers. We don't really need open access. And I've never said this to him because he's a distinguished older professor, but I'm like, maybe not your dad, but maybe somebody else's dad, or brother, or sister, or second cousin. And it is the anecdotal evidence of your personal father not wanting to read these things, to me, is not the last nail in the coffin of open access and the need for it. Because even in the workshops I have ran in Nova Scotia, I have had people with no background in healthcare come up and tell me about how valuable for them it was to access papers on a loved one's condition, or how frustrated they were that they couldn't do the research themselves. So, and this is when it gets usually most personal, when it's healthcare, but sometimes it's, again, environmental toxicology comes up a lot, or sometimes it's that high school kid for their science fair, because science fairs have gotten so much more complicated since I was doing them, who actually wants to read the papers for the purposes of a project they're working on. That happens. And if it's even a very small minority of people, it is enough to make it worthwhile because of the ideas that this breeds. Increased citation rates, again, not rocket science. The more people can read it, the more people will cite it. This is unfortunately still a big currency in when we look at academia, right? Citation rates, H indices, impact factors. And I will come back a little bit, if you bear with me, to my rant about for-profit publishing. The H index and the impact factor are tools of a for-profit industry developed for their own purposes, that have been incorporated as a means of research and researcher assessment in a completely different industry, which is the mostly not-for-profit academic world. And again, the goals are completely different of the for-profit industry, of scientific publishing, and of academics. And I listened to a wonderful interview with Athena MacDonald, who is a physicist at Cambridge, I want to say either Cambridge or Oxford, I'm pretty sure it's Cambridge, who said that the reason people go into academia, into research, is because they want to learn stuff about the world or their chosen subject of research. And what they end up doing is writing high-impact research papers so that they can get grants, so that they can write more high-impact research papers, so that they can get tenure. And she's like, no one goes into research wanting to publish a paper in a high-impact journal. That is not what we want to do. We want to collaborate and learn about the world. The current system is not conducive to that. And I couldn't agree with her more. Importantly, there are a whole lot of other people who can't agree with her more. And hence COARA, the Coalition for Research Assessment Reform, and DORA, the Declaration on Research Assessment. And it's really hard to talk about open science without talking about reform of research and researcher assessment. And that is something I will come back to. global impact. I was just a few months ago at the annual conference of the Open Access Scientific Publishing Society. And the case studies are wonderful, where a journal becomes open access and downloads from Southeast Asia increased by thousands of %. People who want to access this research finally can. There are now whole journals, open access journals, started with the idea, say in seismology. Not only is it fully open access and diamond open access, free to pay, free to publish, but also there is a plain English language summary, an abstract of every single paper, and you can write the abstract in any other language you wish. Because we want people from seismically active regions to access these things, and not just the researchers, the policymakers, the lawmakers, so that they can read this stuff and be like, oh, maybe I shouldn't be doing that highway right there. And this is what people are thinking. This is how they're redefining impact. Not as impact factor, but as actual impact. Now, at this very institution, there are people, and actually Atlantic Canada in general is amazing when it comes to that, developing open access, open educational resources, they're called, which is a big part of open science. And they're developing textbooks which are some of the most actively anti-racist, feminist, equitable books, textbooks you can imagine. Things that get published in paper are never this good. And they're doing it off the side of their desk. And it's, you know, there's no box this ticks, is the quote. And they're saving their students millions of dollars. And this is not considered impact, as normally, I mean, within the current research and researcher assessment framework. And I say, you know, is that really, if that's not impact, then what is? And finally, complying with funder policies. And that's a big one, because funders literally, you know, they pay your bills. And they get to make uncomfortable decisions, and they get to come up with, they hold the stick and the carrot. And that has been incredibly meaningful if you look at the timeline, because it has been funders who have been changing the scene when it comes to this. So in 2016, we have Plan S, which does not stand for science, you might be surprised. It stands for Jan Smits, who is an EU high-level bureaucrat, and I say that with the affection of someone who spent many a wonderful week in Brussels. And he got a top job in DG Research, the Director General of Research, which is effectively a European ministry, an EU-level ministry. And he sat down and someone explained scientific publishing to him. And he was like, wait a minute, you're telling me we pay the researchers for their time, we pay the researchers to do the work with the grants, we pay the peer reviewers for their time, and then we pay to access this stuff. And they're like, yes, Mr. Smits, that's how it works. And he's like, whoa, no. And he came up with Plan S. He pulled together 16 of the major funders, initially only in the European Union, and he said, enough is enough. You're funded by us, you make it open access on the day it's published. And for a few years it worked. I mean, they gambled on two things. They gambled firstly that the funders, the contract researchers sign with the funder is going to be more important than the contract they sign with the publisher that says the publisher retains copyright. And their second gamble was that not a single publisher will actually take the researchers to court. They won on both of these gambles. No one ever got sued. But Jan Smits published an editorial about 3 weeks ago, actually, at this point, in which he, and I'm going to paraphrase, obviously, but he said, oh my gosh, we never saw capitalism coming so hard at us. Because we are just a bunch of, like, again, affectionately, bureaucrats. And we never thought $9,000 APCs are going to be what this is going to lead to. This is not what we wanted. This is not what we intended. I'm not going to say I'm sorry because I can't really say it in writing, but that is almost as far as he got. So this is that other part of the publisher's story where you put a bunch of bureaucrats in a room with the best of intentions, and you know they probably are not as good at capitalism as a for-profit industry is. And that's where we are with the APCs, and that's why Jan Smits and Plan S gets blamed a lot, which I don't think they deserve as much, because they really tried to do a good thing, and now they're trying to do a good thing again, which I'll come back to at the end. But in 2016, this is also when the Tri-Council Open Access Policy came around. Here in Canada, spoiler alert, I mean, a lot of you might not have maybe heard about it or heard too much about it. It is now being jumped to 2023. It is being reviewed. Because if you haven't heard about it, you're in good company of a lot of other people. 2020 is the NIH data sharing policy. The NIH, the National Institutes of Health in the US, the biggest funders of health research in the world. And they said, if we want to cure cancer, it's better if we all work on the data that we have to cure cancer, because we don't have enough people hours or time or ideas to get through all the data we have. We shouldn't be the only ones working on it. We funded it with tax money. Anyone who's got a good idea should be able to look at this data. And that's what they did. And that is also the year the roadmap to open science got published here in Canada. But I don't know if you folks remember, it was the second quarter of 2020, and we all seem to be having other things to do at that time. Mostly, I think, sitting around in our pajamas and wondering whether life is ever going to be the same. So there we go. It kind of flew below the radar. 2021, we have the literal United Nations recommending open science. So that's the year of the UNESCO recommendation for open science. COVID did its part for open science. I mean, obviously, COVID was awful, just to state that for the record. But it also became very obvious that open access publications and open access data literally save lives. And we all learned that lesson, and then some of us very quickly forgot it. But in 2021, the United Nations said, if we want to not drown on an overheated planet, we have to do open science, because otherwise this is not going to work. And they developed that framework, which is so much more than just open access and open data. And in Canada, we had the framework for implementing open by default federal government science. So another kind of, this is also the year, in terms of other countries, where the Chinese also developed their own Institute for Open Science. A lot of places in the world, the biggest funders of science, saying open science is the way to go. And then in 2022, the Nelson Memo, the best kind of left field. Those of us working in open science were not expecting this, but there was a White House press conference and they announced everything funded with federal money will be made open by 2025. And that is now called, well, it was at the time, the Nelson Memorandum. It really, that meant that at this point, the EU, most of China, UNESCO, and the US put all their weight behind open science in terms of federal funding, because this is also the year, 2022, of Horizon Europe. And I am speaking to you at a very exciting time, because just last week, Canada finished its access negotiations to Horizon Europe, which is the biggest pot of R&D funding in the world. It's 100 billion euro, folks, which is probably about 140 billion Canadian dollars at this point. And this money should be accessible to Canadian researchers, SMEs, NGOs, all sorts of research affiliated, possibly institutions, as early as next year. And everything in Horizon Europe, except for things you want to patent or license, except for things you want to protect in terms of IP, everything has to be made open access, and the data needs to be open as well. So at this point, the world is throwing its money in terms of research funding behind open science. And these are, as you can see, these are all funders of one brand or another. These are the huge funders, the US government and the EU, but smaller funders, for example, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which I am a scholar of, but this is a different, these are a different branch of the foundation, the guys who fund the health research. So their thinking is, they're going further than just open access. They're part of a group called Open Science Funders, which is a group of these smaller sort of funders. But the thought behind that is, if we fund this healthcare research, this groundbreaking healthcare research, is because we want to save lives. Lives don't get saved by spending 2 years on trying to edit a paper for the exact requirements of a particular journal, and then having that paper sit in effectively a peer review freezer, or refrigerator anyway, for 2 years. And then 4 years after I've done this research and have these results on how to cure malaria or whatnot, it gets published. That's not how you save lives. And the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation are in the business of saving lives with research rather than getting things published in peer-reviewed research. So what they did is they support their researchers in publishing preprints with open data and open peer review. They're like, the moment you're done, you just submitted this to our preprint server. Don't spend 6 months editing it to be pretty for that journal. Just submit it, give us the data, and we're going to do open peer review, and we're going to look at your data. And everyone else can look at your data and your results, and you can start saving lives now and not 4 years down the line. So people are thinking of ways to do scientific publishing differently. Oh, shoot. Okay. I did warn Bertram this might happen. It's just to give you an idea of scientific publishing, the way it's done now, it's the way it was done more or less when Darwin published his Origin of Species, right? And so much has changed since. The only reason Darwin could do science is because he was a rich white man. And that's how, those were the people that did science. You had to have a king or a queen give you land 3 generations ago for you to have the spare time to engage in this hobby. So much has changed. Women are allowed to get PhDs, and you no longer have to be a landowner to do research, and yet we still publish the way Darwin and his buddies did. 2023, NASA and CERN Year of Open Science. I have the pleasure of being part of those committees now in implementing the open science policies and trying to get them aligned internationally. And we have the review of the tri-agency open access publications. I will run through the rest of it because I talked a lot. This is just to back myself up with someone way more important. This is Dr. Mona Niebuhr, Canada's Chief Science Advisor. Open science is an international movement, and hopefully we will be able to speed up the deployment in Canada as well, which to me is a when and not an if. And again, every other major democracy, and not just democracy funding science, is already doing this. A little bit about the Nova Scotia Open Research Project, which I have the people from Research Nova Scotia here, and I'd like to very much thank them for that as well. The whole idea behind that is, just to give you another quote, which I'm just going to, apologies, just read because it's too long. A policy-driven co-creation process is a series of complex and often magical moments during which people take the most important resource they have, time, coupled with their visions, desires, and knowledge, to address together a compelling issue. This achieves results that cannot be achieved individually. So this is what I've been doing for the past more or less 6 months now. I've been working with researchers, and not just researchers, but administrators, NGOs, students around the province. I have physically, personally spoken to over 100 people around how to design and implement an open science policy for Research Nova Scotia here in Nova Scotia. Because, again, my European experience, it's been mentioned, I worked there for a long time. I've had front row seats to the train wreck that is just top-down policy, dumping that on people without consulting it with them. And that is not the way I believe things should be done. Importantly, a lot of other people have moved on from this idea of how that is how science policy should be done. And this is very much based in talking to the community here. And Research Nova Scotia, Nova Scotia is not a huge province, but it's got a very diverse research ecosystem with smaller and bigger universities, as well as a college, which means that the lessons learned here are actually transferable further afield. The project is based, there's a survey, there have been workshops, and there'll be a tailor-made policy along with a roadmap that will actually hopefully help to implement it. And just to highlight what we are working with, what are the kind of leading guidelines, it's centering the community's needs. Again, bottom up rather than top down. Listening to people and learning what already works, what doesn't work, what are the challenges. Sometimes there's so much going on in terms of open science in the province already. It's almost letting that happen not off the side of a desk and actually valuing people for the work they do already. And data sovereignty. I am very aware of the fact I am a very white, very immigrant person, and of the history that this continent has had in terms of the First Nations populations here and their contact, which has been pretty abhorrent with Western science. And I want to be very clear that there's no place for this in this project. We are centering data sovereignty and establishing an appropriate framework to make sure that none of those wrongs are being done again. So just to sum up, open science is a lot because it's a shift in scientific culture. We're talking about going from competition to collaboration, because if you're supposed to make your things open access, if you do make them open access, if you make the data open, then it's not just about who publishes first, but also what do we get to do after that has been published. How can we actually, again, get from just publishing high impact journals to actually discovering stuff about the universe. It's science as a product to science as a process. So it's the story doesn't end with that journal publication. That's possibly where the conversation begins, because we actually get to stand on the shoulders of giants, which is attributed to Newton and kind of problematic in sexist and racist ways, but it actually makes this possible because you don't have to keep working on things that have already been worked for. You can actually try to build on the work that's been done, not just by reading a paper, because it's really hard to actually build on work just by reading a paper, by looking at the data and the methods. And I apologize because a lot of the time I look at this slide from up here and I'm like, that guy on those stairs looks a lot like a former president of the US. And I just want to be clear, that is in no way an endorsement of the person that this guy looks a little bit like. Science for select to science for all. And I think, you know, most of us, all of us in this room are probably here because we thought science was fun at some point in our lives, right? Hopefully a lot of us still think science is fun. But it is really a way of making it available and accessible to not just those of us with privilege and living close to big cities. Thank you. I have almost...
We have some time for questions, so
yes.
We'll throw it open. Yeah.
Apologies, I have to run, so I'm going to ask, and then maybe you can answer real quick. But I know this is a follow-up conversation that we will have, but just for the sake of this audience, do you have any mandate at this point to speak beyond Nova Scotia, or is this your only Canadian footprint?
I don't even have a mandate. I am contractually obliged to say I can't even speak for Nova Scotia. I can only speak for my project, but I can tell you that I am having conversations with people beyond Nova Scotia at federal and provincial level.
Right. Okay.
But
so
that's
the open science thing that we've been talking about with NRCan, that's something that's certainly
yes.
Yeah. And for me, the interesting question is whether or not the really important open science initiatives that would be community-based, there's endless opportunities, work going on that's community-based. The federal government is now increasingly trying to encourage that kind of community bottom-up citizen science, let's call it that, but not necessarily. And I think the provinces as well. The question is whether the province and the feds can cooperate on that open
Yeah,
science thing.
so alignment is one thing. It's very big, and that's why it's really good that we are having these conversations more widely. But also what worries me, the roadmap to open science, one of their top recommendations was more money for APCs. And I'd really just love to get my face in front of someone and say, please don't, please, that's not where the money should be going. And that's just one part, but yes, these things are happening. Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much. And while we're waiting for more questions, I also just wanted to state that we're super happy that Maria agreed to allow us to tape this. So it will be available on our website afterwards, so we'll let you know about that. Helen?
Yeah, two quick things that come to mind. The first one, I cannot agree more with the whole for-profit publishing, that at this point I'm really struggling with the idea that I'm volunteering my time to review papers that someone else is making money out of. That's not even the authors. And I absolutely believe it's part of my job. I philosophically, I completely agree with the peer review process, but at this point I'm just like, I'm spending hours every month to review something, quote unquote, for free. I mean, we can talk about like the fact that it's part of my salary or whatever, but like, if I say no, no one is gonna come after me or after my job. I can say no to every review that comes from my desk and nobody will care. I say yes because I believe in it.
Yeah.
And sometimes I can't even have access to the paper I have reviewed, but Vidal happens to not have a subscription to the journal
Yeah.
for which I just reviewed. So I think that at this point, like, capitalism coming fast, well, let's reply to capitalism with the fact, okay, well, let's stop doing it on free labor then. Like, I think that at some point, collectively, we have a voice. Those journals run on our time and our expertise. And I do believe we have a little bit more power than we give ourselves credit for. The second thing that is a little bit different, which is like about open access data, one thing that I think is becoming like a very silly but real barrier is how we manage it with the people we collect data from.
Yeah.
The way this is working with ethics board, and again, philosophically, yes, I don't think we should do a prison experiment or a worm experiment without telling people we can get out if we want to. But our informed consent has become 3 pages of free screens long when people are online. They don't read it, they don't understand it, but the one thing we ask at the end is like, can we use your data in a repository? No, you can't. I don't care. They don't understand the impact of it, and we have no resources to explain it. I literally tested this. I lose 30% of my sample by just asking that question. Can I put your data in a repository? Which is completely anonymized. I'm an Excel spreadsheet stuff. And I ask very innocuous questions to people. I'm a marketing researcher. I say, do you like that product? Yes or no? Is it pretty innovative? Really things that are not important or that most people wouldn't care. But the second I ask them, can I put your data in a repository? Boom. I lose part of my sample to it. And I do not know what the solution is, but throwing more information at our participants is not it.
I agree with both. I mean, yes. I hope that wasn't a question because I don't have much to add.
I'm just wondering, like, where are those conversations, like, based on what you're seeing, like,
Oh.
like, yeah, like, where,
Okay.
where are the conversations going in those?
The ethics board, you might not be shocked to find out you're not the only person who has found it challenging. Let's use that nice word. And I understand there are conversations both at a, well, definitely at a federal level about how to make this, how to make it work, and also to make informed consent actually informed consent, and not a whole lot of words I don't understand and then I sign or I don't sign. So that you're in good company with a lot of other people worrying about this, and hopefully they'll come up with something that'll be a solution. And yes, peer review. I mean, my own story with peer review, when I published my big paper from my PhD, which ruffled a bunch of feathers, the first comment I got from the anonymous peer reviewer was, she's a PhD student from Poland, what does she know? And the journal, actually this is the journal Geology, by the way, the journal actually passed this on. And I'm like, I'm working on changing my citizenship as we speak, but you know, at that time there was not much I could do about it. And open peer review is something I think would make, of course it's also problematic in a way, but the way peer review works now, you are most likely to get published if you cite your peer reviewer and also happen to be a white male over 50. And not all of us can tick those boxes. And literally replacing the name with a racialized female name and even leaving the citations of the peer reviewer is enough to get 70% of the papers declined. And these are not people who are avowed racists, who are reviewing these papers. Closed peer review, I mean, there's a whole bunch of bibliometric studies, and I know there are people in this room who know more about this than I do, but peer review, it's not doing for us what we think it's doing necessarily. I mean, this year's Nobel Prize, Professor Katalin Karikó, she could not get any of her stuff published for ages, right? And then she literally went on to save hundreds of millions of lives. This is the peer reviewers telling her, your mRNA stuff is boring and stupid and go home. And guess what? You know, it wasn't. Sorry, because I feel like, I don't know if I answered your question, but open peer review, folks, it's a good idea. Yes?
Add to your rant?
Sorry, I do.
I want to add to it because, you know, you brought up the whole idea of high impact, and we keep having this conversation, and we keep doing their work for them to the back corner there. And the part that every time these types of questions come over my desk, I want to say, you know, part of it is changing our values.
Yes.
Right? At an institutional level, every time we talk about the Times Higher Ed ranking and all those ranking things we're chasing, we're chasing the publications in Nature that are charging the $10,000 US,
Yeah.
and it needs to stop. We need to stop doing that, because really, what is more impactful? It's in Nature, or something like looking at publications, which I've seen researchers do on this campus. They're publishing in small, considered no-impact journals. However, what they're publishing impacts people having certain medications and certain clean drinking water and things like that in environments that are very impactful in small communities, but they don't have the international sensation to be published in Nature because that can't be replicated in a larger population like Toronto or New York or whatever. But we're valuing Nature. We're not valuing the impact that that community now has water or medication or treatment. That's actually the bigger impact to society and the world. But we keep chasing Nature. And that,
I mean, again,
you see my head blowing up.
I can't agree more, and I just, so ERC, the European Research Council, every single European, person working in Europe who's gotten a Nobel Prize had been previously funded by the advanced grant of the European Research Council. So this isn't your, hippie committee of Woodstock. This is about as establishment as it gets in Europe, and what they did is they said, no more submitting your list of publications. Because even though we've signed DORA, even though we say, don't look at Nature, and the way people do it, Nature, Cell Science, bang, here's your money. And that's not what we want. So what they did instead is they said, submit a narrative CV. Tell me on one page, tell me the 3 things you are most proud of. And then we will see if we want to fund you. Because then we are actually funding you on your ideas and on some of your past record, on your track record, and not just on the publications, which, as we know, can be influenced by a whole bunch of things. And the fact that you've been published in Nature is actually, you're likely to not have a replicable study if it's been published in Nature. That's what you're likely to have, quite frankly. And this, I'm not saying this with any meanness. I've quite frankly been published in Nature. So again, I don't mean to poo-poo my own work here, but it's, sorry, science, not nature. Anyway, never mind. So it's just, that's what it tends to be. And narrative CVs, because you might have been published, you might have published everything you've ever written in Nature, Science, and Cell, and you're actually an awful bully, and every single one of your PhD students runs and crosses the street when they see you. And in a narrative CV, when you're trying to talk about the work and the impact you did, they can actually, once you've written how all you ever did was science, and then they ask you, how about the people you mentored? Because you don't mention any of that in your narrative CV. And then you kind of have to go pale and not really talk about that. And they can then decide to not give the most prestigious grant in the European Union to a person who's an awful bully. And that's something we didn't have a system for previously. There are lots of applicants for these grants, and now we're coming up with ideas of how to fund people who aren't toxic, Nature publishers. And the fact that we're coming around, again, the European Research Council, I cannot stress how establishment they are, and yet this is the way they've gone. NASA and CERN, you might not know anything. Obviously you folks know a lot about science, but people who don't know anything know who NASA is. And NASA has decided that they don't care where you publish, they only care you publish open access, and also preferably diamond open access, so free to pay, free to publish. And guess what? You publish a data set, you get as many points as you would for publishing a paper, because that means you're spreading knowledge and people can do stuff with your data. That's NASA and CERN. Again, as establishment as it gets in research. So, I'm hopeful that change is possible also with research assessment, because I can't stress this enough. Again, we can't do open science if we don't start we can't do it properly if we don't start assessing it differently. And I probably have to shut up now, right?
Do we have, I was going to say, yeah, we'll do, if people have to leave, I understand, but unless we're going to be kicked out of the room. Okay, so, and you're okay.
Yeah, please feel free to leave. I talk a lot.
Okay, so this is a very interesting topic. I really enjoyed the presentation.
Thank you.
So I was just thinking, I feel like whenever a presentation is being done, like there were questions that I birthed you. Like what are the main research questions on this presentation? Like, there's so many topics that have been covered, but I was just thinking, like, what was the research question?
There was no.
What questions came to your heart, like, when you started writing this?
I am fortunate or unfortunate, depending on how you look, to no longer be an active researcher. But if, for me, the question is, when I think about this, I mean, the things that have recently, I spend the most time thinking about and talking to people about is, how do we change research publishing and how do we change research assessment? Those are almost, in order to make open science possible, in order to literally cure cancer and solve climate change, I believe that the building blocks of that are reforming research assessment and scientific publishing. And I know it maybe doesn't sound incredibly intuitive, and it's not clear how we get from preprints to cancer vaccines, but I really think that's the way to go. And that's the majority of what I spend my time thinking about lately. Yeah.
Yeah, so thanks for the presentation. I was wondering about the relationship between journals and publishers. And I can see from my experience that we, as a journal, use OJS in order to break free, so to say, from the chains of a publisher. But on the other hand, the publisher is not supporting us with using OJS, so to say. And I was wondering, on an EU level, can we in the future see free infrastructure for OJS use in order to enable journals to go from publishers to their own OJS hosting instance?
So I can't speak for the EU, way less than I can speak for anyone else even, because it's huge. But I can tell you that the one thing I said I'd mention and I didn't, because apologies, but many words a minute from my mouth, is the Plan S, the authors of Plan S have come around when they've realized what they've done inadvertently and unknowingly, and they are sorry for it. They are now saying that the publishers, the big four, that what they should be doing is providing a service to the scientific community. We should revert to them not being the gatekeepers about who gets published and where do they get published. It shouldn't be them making the decisions. It should be them providing the service of editing and hosting and managing the servers and whatnot, and not actually getting to make any of the decisions, but reverting all of the decision-making power to the scientific community. And so that is more or less, I think, to what you are talking about. That is a proposal that's been published literally a couple of weeks ago, and to revert to a system where journals are, where research publishing is researcher-led and owned. Sorry, and last question, because I realize, sorry, it's not my call to say last question, but I'm just realizing people, I don't want people to feel self-conscious about leaving because it's late and, yes, sorry.
I'm curious where you see shadow libraries fit into this conversation, like the SciHub. Partly because I would argue that on some level that's very like research driven. And like just in an assignment that I'm working on, I've noticed that there's a lot more references to SciHubs and literature reviews where researchers will cite that they have accessed these, various search tools, and SciHub is one of them. So there's almost seems to be this interesting like pseudo-normalization or acceptance, while it's still like very much in process of litigation and like illegal, but it's kind of starting to solve this problem as like proof of concept. I'm curious your thoughts on it.
Okay, great. Thank you for the question. That's a great question. So I don't know if you've noticed, but if you've been on SciHub lately, or maybe you don't want to admit that, and that's fine, but there are no recent papers on SciHub because of litigation. And actually, I've listened to an interview with the founder of SciHub, and she's saying that she doesn't care so much about whether she wins or loses the litigation anymore because of what the open access community has done over the past 2 years. She said that where she started from, and again, I'm originally Polish. When I was doing my PhD, I was sending papers to colleagues at the University of Warsaw. Poland was already in the EU, and most researchers still didn't have access, and the EU is the club of the richest countries in the world. So I don't even want to think what the rest of the world is dealing with, right? And so SciHub was a very needed, for those of you who don't know, SciHub had, there's someone who doesn't know, SciHub was just a repository, a completely legal repository of the research papers. People would just submit research papers, upload them there, and no paywalls. And it was based out of Kazakhstan, I think. And the founder is currently on the run, and she's a fugitive. And it's all very James Bond and Bourne conspiracy kind of story. It really is. But she's, in a rare interview she gave, she said that she is no longer worried. Again, if she loses this litigation, it's in India, by the way. That's where they finally went ahead and did it, and with her permission. And if she loses, she thinks that researchers, there's enough open access publications now available that she thinks the world will be okay, and that she can actually go back to doing her own thing. She wants to, immortality is her thing, you know, go figure. She is she's got a very original mind, that's for sure. And so she's like onto immortality now, because she thinks the open access movement has solved her Sci-Hub. The reason for Sci-Hub's existence is almost not existent anymore. So that's I mean, if she says so, who am I to say she's wrong? And I think, I mean, compared to where we were 10 years ago, no one is now saying, well, maybe Yves Gingras sometimes says, but there are a few people who now disagree with with open access being the way we should do things. There are a lot of conversations about how to do it, but I think very few of us are now thinking, yeah, let's put it all behind paywalls and make sure only rich white people have access to it. So I think we're in a better place than we used to be.
Thank you so much. And he's actually in the Master of Information and the Master of Resource and Environmental Management programs. So bringing those topics together.
Thank you so much for your lecture today.
Thank you.
On behalf of the Department of Information Science, we'd like to offer you a gift as a token of
Thank you.
appreciation.
Thank you very much.